Hi, and welcome back to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and we're talking barbarians on the move once again.
We are indeed.
Yeah, and speaking of people on the move, what about those who left Europe, like the Anglo-Saxons?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because it's a great example of how archaeologists have actually changed the accepted historical view. And I think, the books I was mentioning really go into this in a big way. So when I was growing up, a long, long time ago, far, far away, the basic
The Dark Ages?
Yeah, just about. The basic plot line was that even before the Romans left Britain, and they leave Britain in the early 400s because of all the pressure on the heartland, that there had been a few wave of Angles and Saxons who had come to the island, and then after the Romans leave, so about 410, they come in greater numbers. It's kind of wave after wave of Angles and Saxons, and from that you get the development of Anglo-Saxon England, of course, which becomes increasingly sophisticated until you get the Norman invasion, 1066, and William the Conqueror, descendant of the Vikings, and he puts an effective end to Anglo-Saxon England. And this was all, a matter of record. It had been recorded by Gildas in the 6th century that, the Anglo-Saxons had come over, by the Venerable Bede in the 8th century as well. And so it was quite, it's just kind of the accepted view. It's the accepted view, I guess, until the 1970s, but for historians, it's the accepted view until probably about 10 years ago. And now this is seen as completely wrong. So, you have to kind of rethink.
Rewrite your lectures again?
Your whole approach to history. I know, it's just terrible. So the key is that there's very little archaeological evidence for migrations on any kind of large scale at all. So you don't have thousands of people coming over, hundreds and hundreds of people coming over. And archaeologists tell us this because they found no signs of abandonment of rural areas after the end of Roman rule. So it's not like, the whole place clears out and then a new bunch come in. And they use things that historians would never think of, like analysis of pollen samples. Well, I'd never think of that. So an analysis of pollen samples showing that there was no great land clearing of the sort needed for mass migrations. So there wasn't a huge amount of land cleared because there's a whole, wave after wave of Angles and Saxons coming in. So that never took place. And then the craziest thing of all, which I just love, stable isotope analysis of teeth. Yes, again, I wouldn't have thought of that unless I was like hanging out in the dentist's waiting room and he had an article on it. So stable isotope analysis of teeth in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. So in cemeteries that are considered to have Anglo-Saxons buried in them in England show consistently that these are the teeth of local people and not Anglo-Saxon people as previously thought. So it's not the places that we thought were Anglo-Saxon burial sites are the sites of the indigenous people that were there in the Roman period. So we talk about Boadicea and the Iceni people, and or up in Scotland, the Picts. So really, really quite interesting that your whole notion of what the past was like can be changed, and it's those pesky archaeologists again. And so it's really great because, for a long time, we didn't really think about working with other disciplines. We were just like, okay, we're historians. We got it all, got all the answers. And so you have all these other disciplines sticking their, sixpence worth in, and really forces you to rethink a lot of things. So, we were talking about that last time. And we talked about all how it was such a dynamic area, looking at the Aztec and the Olmec and the Maya. But here, the old Anglo-Saxons, completely up in flames and open to new interpretations.
So does that mean there were no migrations into Eastern Europe as well?
No, not really. I mean, these migrations did take place, and we know that because we know when the Huns move out. So again, we know the Alans and the Avars and the Gepids and the Huns come from much far Eastern Europe or West Central Asia, and they come west because it's much like their homes in the steppes, their homeland in the steppes, and they're horse people, and they're looking for pasture for their horses. And the evidence for the eastern migrations comes to us again from these archaeologists, and they're found in the metal ornaments, so the actual material culture that people bring with them. So in the metal ornaments attached to horse harnesses, so lots of things like that. There's also really, really cool stuff, and I don't know if I mentioned this when we were talking about the Maya, but they did some skull shaping. Did I mention that? Probably
no, I don't think you did.
Well, there's evidence of skull shaping as well in the migrations from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. And you know those bike helmets that you get that are kind of pointed,
goofy
like
looking,
aliens at the back, and coming to a point at the back? Well, it's kind of like that because the Huns did that and the Mayans did that too. So when babies were born, they would press their heads between wood, or they would, kind of give them a
concussion?
Yeah, skull shaping that went kind of crazy. And so people, they bind it with tight cloth and kind of elongate the head. And this was common amongst people living north of the Black Sea. It's seen in Austria as well, and it may well have been, they think, a result of copying the Huns, who they admired. So the Huns, not the people that everybody hated at all, but admired by some. It's also there's also evidence, thank goodness for historians, written evidence from Byzantine sources in the 6th century talking about Slavs and Avars, talking about Slavs, discussing their distinct social organization, that they were non-hierarchical, non-centralized, and they lived in small settlements, or also talking about the Avars from the east, saying that they were horse riding, they were a nomadic people, that they used iron stirrups, that they had complex bows like the Mongols, remember we talked about that, and that they were buried with their horses, so they're really, it's not just a dog is a man's best friend, it's a horse is a man's best friend.
So we're talking about people that are on the move, right? But who's on the move and dangerous?
You want all the good stuff, you
I
boys.
do.
You always want to know who all the crazy guys are. Well, again, it comes back to the Huns, I think. The 370s, but 374 AD. It's the Huns. They move into southern Russia. They wipe out the Ostrogoths. Then they attack Ost, of course, meaning east. So that's the Eastern Goths. And then they attack the Visigoths. The Visigoths move west towards Rome, the Roman frontiers, and the Huns are still on the move, and they're led by Attila the Hun, the greatest of the Huns. The Huns are also referred to as the scourge of God, and we've heard that before when we were talking about the Mongols, who come, 800 years later, called the scourge of God as well, Genghis Khan. So coming out the same general area. So Attila, and he's undergone a bit of a renaissance as well, because he read one or two articles anyway by remember when the Ukraine became kind of independent from the Soviet Union, and Attila is now seen, perhaps by some scholars anyway, as an early Ukrainian nationalist who was just kind of misunderstood. So not, kind of bloodthirsty killer. So forget about all those stories of him drinking out of the skulls of his slain enemies. And instead think of him as a kind of wise and tolerant diplomat who was an early nationalist from that area, in the area that we call Scythia. So Attila undergone a bit of a change in attitude towards him, but Attila is actually very interesting because he's a good example of what happens to barbarians moving in and out of the empire. So although everybody's being pushed in front of the Huns, Attila is co-opted by the Romans in some points in his career, and he's asked to take down the Burgundians, and he actually has to be called off because he's taken them down so hard that there's not going to be any of them left. And the Romans are like, oh, wait a minute, we didn't mean wipe them completely out. He also went after Constantinople, this great center in the 440s, and he had to be bought off, and that seemed to be something that you could do with Attila. Like all Huns, negotiated on horseback. I think he negotiated with Pope Leo the Great, and the poor Pope had to sit in his horse the whole time, negotiated for all sorts of things. So he has to be bought off by the fathers of Constantinople, and he returns to Western Europe, to Gaul, which is kind of modern-day France, and demanded the hand of Emperor Valentinian's sister, And he's like, no, I don't think so. And so he's mad about that. So he switches sides and he fought alongside the Ostrogoths and their Germanic allies against the Romans. And the Romans by this time had an alliance with the Franks, the Saxons, and the Burgundians. And so there's this huge fight with barbarians on both sides at Troy near Paris, and no clear winner, and Attila withdrew. And I mean, he has a really long history in Western Europe, but he withdraws at this point. He's not. He hears a prophecy. The men that read bones for him say that, you know, a great man will fall the next day, and he's not sure if it's going to be him or if it's going to be the Roman guy. But anyway, you know, he goes back over the Alps, and 2 years later we see him again in his base in Hungary. And he marries a woman, I think her name's Ildiko, and he seems to have a huge big feast. And when the family show up the next morning after the first night of debauchery in the bridal chambers, he's dead. So I think he's been stabbed, and some people say it was her brothers that did this. So that's the kind of end of Attila. And the Huns had absolutely great battle tactics, and some of them should sound quite familiar, because we talked about the Huns. So they made things. They did things like they had lots of noise on the battlefield. They feigned flight from the field of battle. They had these ugly, hardy little horses. They used volleys of arrows. They had saddles, and they had wooden spurs, and they wore special shoes for riding. And they had the recurve bow, which we saw for the Mongols later on, and they took their craftsmen with them. So how barbaric can you be when you actually move your craftsmen with you everywhere you go? You know,
yeah.
They're making all sorts of grave
Make
goods.
everyone else sound like barbarians.
You know, they're making all sorts of grave goods as well. So the craftsmen to make these bows and arrows. So great battle tactics. They came in wedge formation. They did all the stuff that frightened people. And this is a good example of, usually you see the victors, so like the Romans will write about them and say really mean stuff about them, but this is really good because this is a Goth historian writing 2 centuries later about the Huns, and this is a quote, that the Huns were the spawn of a Scythian sorceress with demons of the wilderness. So a Scythian or a Scythian sorceress having it off with demons of the wilderness creates the Huns. And these people grew into monsters with scarred faces, and it looks like they scarified their faces anyway. They were good at writing, but they had the nature of the beast. They were oriental, but startling because of their head shape modification. So like people are like, ooh, those Huns, they're just crazy. Now, one of the other groups that's on the move at this period are the Visigoths. The Visigoths, and or as my Spanish teacher said, the Visigoths. I think that sounds way cooler. Another one of those words I like, the Visigoths. I wish I could meet one. So the Visigoths, one of the largest groups, they lived originally north of the Black Sea in a place called Dacia, and Dacia, they're dated there to about maybe about 270 AD. And when the Huns appeared, the Visigoths crossed the Danube and asked the Romans for some help, and that's the late 4th century. So they're one of these groups that settle inside the Roman borders, but then they rise against the Roman Emperor Valens in 378, and it's the Battle of Adrianople, and so they rise against the Roman emperor, and then his successor, Theodosius, makes peace with them and paid cash subsidies for men that had to be requested for use as soldiers. But in 410 AD, they rise again under another famous, famous barbarian leader, Alaric. And Alaric, just a decade before that, Alaric had been a general for the Romans with 20,000 troops under his care. And he takes advantage of the death of Theodosius and the subsequent territorial split of the empire. And in 410, he crosses the Alps to Italy, and he's actually... it seems, and I think in that book by Terry Jones, it talks quite a bit about this, that Alaric actually tried to negotiate with the Roman senators, and they double-cross him. And so he ends up laying siege to Rome in 408 AD, and then come to an agreement, and then they double-cross him again, and so he sacks Rome in 410 AD, and so this is like the heartland has been sacked by Alaric. And Alaric, what Alaric really wanted was he wanted a homeland for the Goths, you know, some place for themselves, and he doesn't live long enough to see this happen. But they move south and west into southern France and Spain, and they do become Roman allies again, so it's not, you know, just a kind of one-off. And they're actually given the kingdom of Toulouse, and they expand then into Vandal territory, and we're going to talk about the Vandals. Vandal territory, which is in Spain, and they last there until they're defeated by the Umayyad armies of the Islamic world in 711 AD. Now, I was just reading, I'm kind of behind on The Economist, so this was The Economist from November 5th, 2011, and it's the section at the back, it's my favourite, tells you about all the new books, and it's a new book by Norman Davies, and it's called Vanished Kingdoms, The History of Half-Forgotten Europe. And wasn't I just looking at it, and it says that, you know, some of the areas that he talks about have kind of disappeared. Most readers will have a vague idea about Prussia. Few will know of the Visigoths' kingdom of Tolosa, centered approximately on modern Toulouse. And we're just talking about that. So not so vanished after all, Mr. Norman. Ha! Take that. So I thought that was kind of cool. But after that outbreak, so the Visigoths have about a 300-year run of power, but they don't become the successor state to Rome. And really that's what we're starting to look for now. You know, the Huns come in, the Visigoths come in. There's all these groups on the move. Is anybody going to be able to take over from the Romans after they've attacked them and the Roman Empire falls apart? And the Visigoths, they don't seem to become the successors to Rome because they don't try to work with local populations, and more importantly probably, and we've seen this before in our little discussions, they don't seem to have a system of succession, so they don't seem to have a way of handing down succession. There's lots of assassinations, so they don't become the next group. One of the other groups though is a group called the Vandals, and we use that word commonly in English. Oh, you're a right vandal, you.
Someone vandalized this wall.
I know, like writing stuff, graffiti all over my Occupy the History Hut movement and stuff. And you'd be like, what kind of vandal are you? Well, there's actually a whole people called the Vandals, and so again they lived in an area west of the Danube, and they pushed west as the Goths were pushed west by the Huns, and they move into the Alps with this other group, the Alans. Then they cross the Rhine, and this is a group that's actually in moving in a large numbers, about 100,000 of them. So all the other groups that we talked about, little movements, but this is 100,000 or so. And they move to Mainz in the winter and then into Frankish territory. So it's not an elite invasion. This is a group with families. So these are settlers. They're not great warriors, but nonetheless, they manage to pillage Gaul, and they defeat the Roman army that's sent out to kind of sort them out. So they get rid of them. And then they turn south. They go through Bordeaux and then across the Pyrenees Mountains in about 409 and then into Spain. And they're into Spain, a territory where Roman control is really non-existent. And so they hold Spain as a kind of breakaway province, and they convert to Christianity. And in 421, a huge Roman army is raised to reconquer Spain, and it's really quite a bloody campaign. They do conquer the Vandals by about 426, and the Vandals decide that they're just going to leave. Like, that's it. They're not staying here anymore, so they're going to leave en masse. And what they do is really cool. They take over the harbour, and they seize all the ships in the harbour, and they get ready to leave. So under their leader, by this time Alaric, they decide to organize this amazing migration. So there's about 80,000 men, about 40,000 of fighting age, and with all in all, with their families, there's about maybe 150,000 of them, and they sail over in numbers of about 100 per ship. So they make like 1,500 ferry crossings. To and from Tangier, so they sail over to North Africa. So they moved their entire population to North Africa, and then once they landed, they walked east through what is now Libya, past Tripoli and the settled areas of Roman Africa, and they're seen as liberators by African people who had been under the Roman thumb. And by 435 AD, such is the state of Rome and the empire that the Roman Empire recognizes Gaiseric's rule over Libya. They won't give up Carthage. That's their favorite place. But the Vandals just take Carthage by storm, and by 439, you have Gaiseric building a large navy. Rome's response in 440 was to build a navy so that they would go over there and just thrash the Vandals. And they have 1,100 ships ready to go, and it's ready to sail from Sicily. But instead, Rome was forced to sign a treaty with Gaiseric so that they could get grain exports from North Africa, because those had been shut off. And the reason that the Romans don't send the fleet over is because the Huns have attacked Rome itself, and the Vandals then go on to sack Rome in 455 AD. So there's tons of stuff going on.
Well, we'll continue our discussion on the barbarians on the move and
Yep.
Rome and all that good
They're
stuff
still on the move.
in part 3.
Okay.